It's Wednesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Tobias Ellwood, Scottish Labour Party leader Anas Sarwar, SNP MP Drew Hendry and political strategist Jo Tanner. Today, it's the day before local elections. Is cost of living the #1 issue?
We're doing everything that we can, but we also have to show some fiscal restraint in order to prevent the problem getting worse.
I think it's essential to help people right now because many people are really struggling with these higher prices.
We'll talk about where elections are across the UK and what they mean. Boris Johnson is praised in Ukraine. Will his critics at home think again?
Britain was changed for the better because we cared enough to be disciplined enough to win.
Blair backs Starmer. Is the former Prime Minister still relevant? Let's start with an interview that the Labour leader Keir Starmer did this morning on ITV's Good Morning Britain, where he's challenged about whether beers and a takeaway curry his team had in campaign offices in Durham, you can see this image here, whether that last year broke lockdown rules when the country was under Tier 2 restrictions, which meant that indoor social mixing outside of households and support bubbles weren't or wasn't permitted unless reasonably necessary for work purposes. Let's have a listen to a bit of that interview.
We were preparing for the next day. We were doing all the things that we have to do. This is what we do when we're on the road, because we're out all day. Now, we were in the office to do that work. At some point, this was in the evening, everybody's hungry, and a takeaway was ordered. It was then delivered into the kitchen of the offices.
Well, it sounds very much like a birthday cake at an event where people were working, which is exactly what the Prime Minister
in Durham, all restaurants
said.
and pubs were closed, so takeaways were really the only way you could eat. So this was brought in, and at various points, people went through the kitchen, got a plate, had something to eat,
Have
and got on with their work.
the police been in touch with you about it?
I think they put a statement out last week saying they weren't going to reinvestigate.
And they haven't contacted you since?
No, they haven't.
Anas Sarwar, can I start with you? Are questions about this legitimate, or is it mudslinging by opposition parties?
Look, I think fair enough asked questions, and Keir Starmer's answered those questions. I think what you've seen, though, from the Daily Mail in particular and from the Conservative Party is to try and create this muddy the waters, or try and say to the British people that all politicians are the same, every organisation is the same, so therefore negating the criminal acts of Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak. And I think that degrades our politics. I think people can see past it. I saw Wes Streeting earlier in the day saying that actually Boris Johnson is not the same as his Conservative colleagues. I would share that sentiment. They should not try and draw some kind of false equivalence between Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer. This is a man in Boris Johnson that has embarrassed the United Kingdom, continues to embarrass it every single day, broke the law, has been fined, the police are investigating, there's a Sue Gray report. Let's not try and draw some false equivalence on this.
All right, Tobias, what about you? Mudslinging or legitimate questions to ask of Keir Starmer?
Well, I think the police have taken a look at this. I understand if it's for them to make a judgment of this, but I would say that the country is supposed to be focusing on local elections, as you introduced, and we need to move forward from this. My concern with the Conservative side was actually in number 10, the lack of focus, the lack of discipline, the cultural challenges that we were seeing there, which weren't to the standards that I'd expect number 10 to be run, and for a Conservative Party as well. But today is about local elections, so all these headlines, I think, distract us from what we should be talking about, which is the fact who's best placed to run your local services.
All right, we're going to talk about local elections. Of course we are, but the questions aren't going away, Jo. Is perhaps the bigger mistake by the Labour Party and the Labour leader is the way they've handled the questions about this?
I've been quite struck at how many people have said to me, I'm just sick of it. I'm sick of the conversation. I'm sick of hearing about it. And I think the challenge is, having gone in so hard, the risk now is...
By the Labour Party.
By the Labour Party. The risk, actually, in that interview this morning was that Keir Starmer started talking about people going into a kitchen and getting food for themselves. Well, that was really against the rules, because you were supposed to have individual meals. You weren't actually supposed to be in a communal area where you were sort of, you know, all breathing over the same food, for example. So there is a risk that, as this has gone on, it's sort of people digging themselves into bigger holes and then having more questions to answer than when this first started. And I think the public are quite frankly sick of it. But at the same time, I think if you're going to go really hard on the attacks, you have to answer the questions yourself about events that you may have attended.
Well, I mean, Drew, Henry, what is your view about questions around these issues? Because the SNP certainly felt it was mudslinging at Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, when she was questioned about briefly appearing without a mask indoors, breaking COVID rules in Scotland. Do you see an equivalence here with Keir Starmer?
Well, let's find a point of agreement first off, unusually with Anas. This is an issue that comes up when the Tories are looking to deflect from their law breaking, and what they're doing just now is clearly trying to make this not about them but about everybody else, and looking into all these different things rather desperately and grubbily, trying to find ways to protect Boris Johnson. It's like an extension of Operation Big Dog.
Right, well, questions for the Labour leader, but also for Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister. He is still in hot water over allegations of Partygate. Let's just show you this headline in the HuffPost. A Conservative MP has called on Boris Johnson to hold a confidence vote in himself. Well, that Conservative MP, conveniently, is you, Tobias Ellwood. Has anything changed your mind, or you still want him to go?
So I'm just going to repeat what I just said a few minutes ago. Today is about local elections. So all these points, all these questions are absolutely valid. But I think they are to take
But what's the answer? Do you still want him to go, though?
Sorry?
I mean, that's a straightforward question. Do you still want Boris Johnson to go?
I will answer these questions in full, make a judgment as to where our party should go, as I'm sure others will after the local elections. But making a judgment about the Prime Minister a couple of days before or a day before the local elections, I think is a distraction. I want to actually emphasise the fact that if you vote for a Conservative council, you're likely to get lower council tax. That's where I'm going to focus. So you can say I'm dodging the question. It's going to be for 24, 48 hours. And then, absolutely rightly, we can then come back to these bigger issues.
But no doubt you will be asked about it on the doorstep, because you've been very public about it, and that's fine.
What you're doing, as viewers are watching this, perhaps trying to praise what they're going to do tomorrow, is then bleed into the national issues. I remember being a local councillor, knocking on doors, trying to get people to vote for local matters, and then, of course, then to actually distract from the national matters. And what we're doing is bleeding the two together.
That is absolutely fine, but as you know, any local election is also, to some extent, a verdict by voters on what's going on nationally.
Only if you let it.
You've spoken about Boris Johnson. All I'm doing is quoting what you've said in the past and whether you've changed your mind or not about whether he should go. You don't want to say categorically now. Perhaps this will change your mind. The Prime Minister addressing the Ukrainian Parliament yesterday. Here's the response he got. Everyone applauding the Prime Minister after he addressed the Parliament. You saw the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky there. Boris Johnson praising the courage of the Ukrainians in their courage to fight off the Russians after the invasion, still going on 2 months later. He's being lauded there by Ukrainian MPs. Does that give you pause for thought in calling for him to go, even though you're not going to make that decision finally for a few days?
Well, there's no doubt that the Ukrainians are absolutely pleased with Britain's support. I addressed the same Parliament a week before the elections, but I was there in person, and the gratitude for Britain is overwhelming. It started in 2014 when we began to arm and train the Ukrainians. But the big question there, and it relates to the cost of living, is what is our objective? What are we trying to achieve in Ukraine? What are we actually pumping all these weapons into? Nobody can give me an answer to that. Is it to flush out Russia in its entirety from mainland Ukraine, which is what I would like to see? Is it to agree to some form of stalemate, which perhaps we're heading towards for Donbass?
Sure.
Now, tactically, lots of ideas. Different countries doing different things, but NATO hasn't got a collective strategy of how to deal with Russians in Ukraine or a grand strategy to deal with Russia itself. These are the things I would like to see the Prime Minister exhibit the statecraft that then leads other countries, the convening power. This is what Britain usually is good at, getting other countries to align to make sure that we can stand up to Russia, because this is not going away.
All right, no, it's not going away. And is Boris Johnson still, in your mind, the best person to lead the West response and lead in Britain when it comes to this war?
OK, at the moment, it needs to be a collective effort by all these nations.
It wouldn't matter if Boris Johnson was at the head or not?
Right. Well, I made this case before. the scale and capability of our Whitehall machine, the MOD construct, means that the advice, the risk assessments, the recommendations that are made to number 10 to any Prime Minister would remain. If the Prime Minister is replaced, then absolutely, I think our policy towards Ukraine actually would probably get even stronger, because you'd have candidates falling over themselves to provide even more assistance to the country.
Anyone you favour particularly?
We're jumping way ahead. Let's get the local elections out of the way.
All right, well, we may be jumping way ahead, although it is something Tobias Ellwood has actually called for. Does the individual matter? Do you agree with Tobias Ellwood in terms of the response to something like Ukraine? Would it be a good time to change the leader?
It'd be a disaster. I mean, what would happen? The fact is, we do not have a system in this country where you can change a leader of a party very easily. So what would happen while we're waiting for that process to be borne out? I mean, it would be... We're already behind. We are massively behind in big issues like health and social care, for example. COVID has massively derailed many policy areas. So did actually the Brexit debate. So then having another few months while everyone navel gazes and discusses who they think the best person for the job is doesn't help. Yeah, but focus of government does, Tobias. Focus does. Let's face it, you do not have then a firm leader. You do not have someone that can go and talk to NATO and actually have proper discussions and lead a proper debate, which, to be fair to Boris, I would say Boris Johnson has at least taken much more of a stand and has been much more vocal than most of the other NATO leaders.
But then you're
which you have to acknowledge
to never change a leader
worthwhile.
Unless you go to a general election. Our party has
you
done
have
this
to
in the
choose your
past.
time
It could
wisely.
be that I'm in the minority. It could be that there is enough support for Boris, and I firmly understand that, which is why a while ago I suggested that he actually call a vote of confidence in himself. But this isn't for today. This is a big discussion, important questions, but really for Friday and the weeks after that follow.
All right, we're going to talk about the local elections, as you have mentioned them, because, of course, voters will be going to the polls across the UK tomorrow. Let's welcome Professor John Curtis, our elections expert and guru. John, I'm just going to show viewers and our guests here this map. You can see the darker shaded areas where elections are actually taking place across the UK. Can you give us a guided tour of these elections?
Well, we first of all have whole council elections in 3 parts of the United Kingdom. That is London for all the London boroughs, for Scotland for all of Scotland's 32 councils, and also for all 22 councils in Wales. The more complicated bit is in provincial England, where your map will indicate that some places have elections and some places do not. For the most part, it's the more urban parts of England that are tending to have elections. And in most, though not in absolutely all of them, it's only 1/3 of the seats that are up for grabs. So that does therefore mean that there are limits on the extent to which there can be changes of control outside of London. Indeed, it means around 40% of all the seats in England are actually being contested are actually in London. Because in practice, the elections outside of London are more limited in their scope.
What will be interpreted as a good and bad night for the parties, your benchmarks?
Well, to be honest, insofar as the crucial question to which people want to know the answer, including, I think, Tobias Ellwood in your studio, is how much damage has Partygate done for the Conservative Party? I think my main advice is don't take too much notice of seats gained and lost or of councils that may or may not be lost by the Conservatives, because you have to remember that for the most part, the baseline for these figures are 2018, which is a very, very different world. It's the world when Theresa May was struggling to keep our party together over Brexit, and when Conservative and Labour were roughly neck and neck in the polls and were certainly roughly neck and neck in that year's local elections. We are not looking at how far the Conservative Party has fallen since the 2019 general election. What, however, will be possible once you look at the votes, as opposed to get waylaid by the seats and councils, in many places is to compare the votes cast this year with votes cast last year in local elections outside of London and with the GLA election within London. And I think so far as, you know, the principal question that Westminster politicians are interested in, as opposed to voters who might actually be interested in who's running their local council, then to be honest, that's probably going to give Tory MPs their best indicator. The other thing you have to realise about these elections is that because it's not all of the country that's voting, the bit of the country that's voting is disproportionately Labour,
And insofar as the Conservatives are defending very much, it's outside of London. And as I've already said, it's only 1/3 of the councils that are up for stake. Now, as a result of that, even if the polls are correct as to the extent of the damage that Partygate has inflicted on the Conservative Party, probably the number of councils where the Tories will lose control will not number more than the two sets of fingers on my hands. In other words, it's not going necessarily to produce dramatic changes because there are all these boring technical reasons to do with the psephology of the election.
What about the picture in Scotland?
In Scotland, it's much easier because all of Scotland has an election, and therefore, in the end of the day, we will be able to add up the votes in Scotland and know, in a sense, very clearly who has won. Now, there are really 2 points of interest in Scotland. The first is the battle between the two principal unionist parties, the Conservatives and Labour. The Conservatives have come second in every ballot in Scotland, i.e. the largest unionist party, second to the SNP, at every election since 2016. However, the polls, including one that's come out this morning, but all the polls basically since Christmas, are saying that the Labour Party are now running second north of the border and the Conservatives have fallen third. These are always going to be difficult local elections for the Conservatives in Scotland because, unlike in England, again, this is another boring but crucial psephological point, the elections were last held in 2017, not in 2018, and this is the world when Theresa May had called in a general election because she thought she was miles ahead in the polls. And in Scotland, at least, the Conservative Party were making very substantial progress. They recorded their best election since 1982. Now, all of that was going to fall back anyway, and it's fallen back even more because of Partygate. The second crucial question is just how well will the SNP do? Because in 2017, actually, the SNP didn't do that well. The local election results presaged the quite substantial fallback in their support in the general election a few weeks later. So they ought to make some progress. However, the Greens are also running high. The Greens also are basically very much now a party that is foraging amongst yes voters. So the crucial question here is how much do the Greens take off the SNP?
All right, and working with the SNP as they do in government. John Curtis, stay with us. Thank you for all of that context. Anna Sarwar, let's come to you first of all. Is beating the Conservatives to second place your objective?
Well, I think John covered it very well, as you'd expect Professor Curtis to do. Of course, we want to demonstrate progress in this election. There's been lots of chat about Labour coming in second place. The mood music's been good, the polling's been good, but ultimately the poll that matters is how people vote tomorrow and the count on Friday. And the point I'd make is, look, I don't aspire for Labour to be in second place. I aspire for Labour to be in first place. But we've got a lot of work to do to make that a reality, and that's probably one step too far in this election, but that's the hard work we want to do in communities, towns, villages and cities across country between now and the general election and now in the next Scottish Parliament election. So we're competing to actually win, not competing for second place.
Right, competing to win, Drew.
Well, the SNP, after 15 years in government, are in absolutely great shape, but we're taking nothing for granted. And this has been a very well organised and committed campaign by SNP council candidates across Scotland who are all dedicated and fighting towards supporting communities and households through the cost of living crisis. And the best message that voters in Scotland can give to a Tory government that's utterly failing on the cost of living crisis, which they in part created through Brexit, is to vote SNP tomorrow at the polls.
Right, well, let's talk about some of the party management expectations. Jo, you will know all about this. We've already seen it in operation. The Daily Telegraph headline, Tories set to lose 550 seats in worst local election performance in a generation. And then we can roll on to The Guardian. This is Labour, an example of Labour trying to manage expectations. Labour on thin ice at local elections, despite poll lead warn party chiefs. Nothing to surprise you there, then, in terms of that party management?
No. I mean, it's always the only poll that counts is polling day, and it's always about how long you've been in power and therefore, what the reaction might be of the electorate. I'm not sure any of us really know how the electorate are going to respond. My big fear is actually that turnout's going to be low. And quite frankly, I said the other day to somebody, I really hope as a local activist, as a local councillor, people are shouting at you constantly about bin collections and potholes, because that's what they're out there to talk about, rather than talking about what's been going on in Westminster and how bad things have been. Those people that are knocking on doors up and down the country want to talk about those local issues.
In terms of Westminster, because a spotlight has been shone on the sort of toxic culture at Westminster, particularly over the last few weeks. Did you want to ask the politicians here about what you're worried about in terms of the impact of that on people taking an interest in politics?
It really struck me that I've spent a lot of my career trying to help women, for example, get into politics, concentrating on, you know, people that we used to talk to people who would run a campaign about a school crossing, and you'd say, come on, you're exactly the sort of person we need in Westminster. But I wonder now, you know, the politicians on the panel, would you encourage your sons, daughters, would you go into a school with your head held high and say, go into politics, it's a really great career? Because it's a hard sell at the moment, surely.
Tobias?
Yeah, I mean, two big questions there. Firstly, about encouraging the gene pool of people that end up being in cabinet, you know, in government, and then, of course, our Prime Minister. And I do worry that everything that's been going on actually distracts people. It deters people from stepping up and wanting to do public service in this way, not just at MP level, but councillor as well. But if I can just stress, this isn't just about bin collections and potholes. It's about council tax. We're in Westminster here. Council tax here, Band D, is £860. Go north, south, east to west to Brent. Let me finish, please. Brent to Lambeth,
you can do all the electioneering.
£1,600. It's almost double.
You've had the opportunity to do that.
Vote Conservative.
All right, Anna Sawa, from a political family, would you, in answer to Jo's question, encourage members of your family, young people you know, to go into politics at the moment?
Well, Jo, the honest answer is I would say no, particularly in terms of family members. You're right. I mean, I'm from a political family. I grew up in a political household. I saw what my own parents went through. I never ever aspired to be in politics myself, but got the bug at an early age when I joined the Labour Party. But I wouldn't want my children to get that bug, if I'm being frank about it, because politics feels intolerant, it feels unwelcoming, it feels divided. And particularly, I think, for young women coming forward, it feels like an unwelcome place. And that's on all of us to try and address that. But we can't pretend that our politics, the way our political discourse goes, the way that we encourage division, the way that division is amplified, particularly on social media feeds, doesn't then feed into how people then think about whether they want to come forward or not. And you know, regardless of which political party people are standing from in local council elections, I take my hat off to every single one of them, because it is a thankless task, it is very divisive, it is taking an impact on you personally and your family. But for people to be putting themselves forward to be local champions, regardless of which political party, I think is really honourable. But how do we get that dignity and respect back into our politics is really, really important.
Well, Drew, do you share those fears and concerns?
Well, I do go into schools. You can ask at the schools around here, and I encourage particularly girls and young women to get into politics. I don't agree with Alistair, that this is something to be shied away from. I think if we're going to make change, we need to have more young people involved in politics and taking an interest in that. There is a problem, a systemic problem in politics, and particularly on social media. But that's for us to deal with, not to hold back future generations. That's why I'm particularly proud in Scotland. That's why I'm particularly proud in Scotland that 16-year-olds have got the vote. We need to have more women, girls, young people involved in politics so we get better representation across the piece.
Anas, you were trying to say something?
Yeah, I would just say I wasn't for a second suggesting what Drew seems to be suggesting I was, but I don't think shouting traitor, quisling, hater of our country, who loves Scotland, who doesn't, who loves Britain, who doesn't, who's truly in it for the right reasons, who's not, shouting people down, I don't think any of that helps encourage people into politics, and I think every party needs to reflect on that.
None of that helps, but it's up to us to deal with that. The ones that are elected just now, people that are elected in power just now have got a responsibility to deal with this so that future generations can get the representation that we need, so that we can get new life, new blood, new ideas into politics.
All right, well, we were talking there a little bit about independence. I mean, Jo, first of all, before we move on, what did you make of that?
It's very interesting. I mean, I've always found people come up to me and sort of say, why do you work in this industry? Why do you do what you do? And I'm not even a politician, just having worked with so many. But I find it interesting because it is a tough sell. And I think the family impact is a massive thing that actually a lot of us don't understand. The one thing I would say that I find really positive was the meeting where the news of Neil Parish and what he was watching on his phone, and very inappropriate that was. What I think is really refreshing is that people are speaking up now. People are speaking up in a way that they really should have done for years. The reality is that the party system doesn't work, the whipping system. People probably knew that was going on. They probably had heard that story
Well,
before.
it looks as if they have, because we're hearing stories, historic stories.
Exactly. And so I think there is something refreshing that actually things are being done as a result of things that are being said. And what I do hope is that the politicians that do stand and are continuing to serve now will continue to speak up, because that's the only way the system's going to change for the better.
All right, John Curtis, I hope you're still there listening to the debate. I said I wanted to ask you another question. It's about the independence referendum issue in Scotland. If it were to be held tomorrow, what would happen in your mind?
The honest truth is that we don't know, and that's the problem that faces both Nicola Sturgeon and Boris Johnson. This morning's poll, yes 49, no 51, and that's pretty typical. The polls have now, certainly over the last year or so, have typically been having no very slightly ahead of yes. But certainly the position in Scotland is now much narrower between those two camps than it was at the time of the 2014 referendum. And in truth, this is one of the pieces of collateral damage from Brexit. Scotland, of course, voted very strongly to remain by almost 2-1. And what's very clear is that basically during the course of 2019, when you and I, Jo, had our eyes on College Green and the various drama that was going on in the House of Commons, in Scotland what was happening was that those people who had voted Remain were beginning to shift in decisive numbers towards yes. Not enough to produce necessarily a majority for yes, but certainly to take us to a 50-50 situation. So therefore, basically, we just don't know what would happen, and that therefore holding a referendum at any point in the near future is a very substantial risk, both for the Scottish Government and for the UK Government.
Thank you very much, John Curtis. And, of course, you will be there through the night, won't you, covering all the elections, giving analysis from, I think, 11:40, isn't it, right through till 6 o'clock in the morning. Lucky old you.
And, of course, you, Jo, will be up in the morning, nice and fresh, and you'll then be able to take over from us.
I will be up at 6 o'clock and on air from 9 o'clock until 1. Thank you very much, John. Drew, let's pick up on some of the things that John Curtis said there. It is obviously a very finely balanced thing in his mind and according to the polls. And the SNP can they give us a cast-iron guarantee that that referendum will be held by the end of 2023, as promised by Nicola Sturgeon?
Well, you've just said it yourself. Nicola Sturgeon has just said that the referendum will be held before the end of 2023, and that's the absolute intention to do that. I don't think it can be any more unequivocal than that.
Right. Is there also a problem, though, at a practical level? It's a mammoth task, as you will know, to organise a vote to happen within the next 18 months or so. I just want to tell viewers some of the things that you will need to consider and have in place before the vote can actually take place, because the SNP's plan is for an independent Scotland to rejoin the EU. There will have to be an application for that as an independent country. Then there's the issue of the Anglo-Scottish border. As a member of the EU, Scottish trade with the rest of the UK would be governed by the same rules as apply to trade between Great Britain and the EU. There's also the issue of the currency that we'd use and the economic plan. Are you really able to sit there and say that that's all going to be in place before autumn next year?
Yes, I mean, unlike the Brexit vote, which was a complete and utter shambles with no more than a single side of paper with A4 paper with a couple of lies written on it, there'll be a full prospectus put.
Have you started any of it?
People.
Have you actually started any of the work on this?
Work was started before the pandemic.
And how far are you?
Well, that was paused during the pandemic. I'm not in the Scottish Government, so I'm not in a position to tell you the state of that work at the moment. What I can tell you is that work is now going on. It's being completed very thoroughly, so that prospectus, as it was in 2014, can be put very clearly to the Scottish people. In 2014, there was a book that was put forward in terms of the white paper, which was very detailed.
Yes, it's more complicated now post-Brexit, though, isn't it?
Well, you know, in many ways it's less complicated now post-Brexit, because, you know, we'd be rejoining the largest market on our doorstep, the European Union. Would be.
But your application's got to be accepted first of all by the EU, hasn't it?
Yeah, and I think anyone who's been listening to the mood music across the EU would understand that it's going to be looked on very warmly by the European Union members. They are about expanding the EU, and Scotland is a perfect candidate given its natural resources, with 25% of Europe's
and a
wind and
border
wave power
between an independent
potential.
Scotland and the rest of the UK.
Well, there's now borders between the other 27 EU countries because of Brexit. Of course, there are issues to sort out. But at the moment, if you look at what the difficulties that are being caused by a Brexit, as John Curtis said, that was imposed on Scotland that voted against it, what we're seeing is our trade being decimated. We're seeing lots of problems with the cost of living, with price increases coming through because of Brexit.
Although many of those things, of course, the Scottish
harm.
government could actually act on now. But let me just go to Anna Sawar to respond, because you've set out the prospectus. Drew Hendry, Anna Sawar, has said it is going to happen, that independence referendum. They'll have a mandate, he believes, obviously after these elections again. And there is already a mandate. Anna Sawar, so it's going to happen.
So this is the same game that Nicola Sturgeon's been playing now for 8 years, keeping the SNP membership believing that the referendum is round the corner or independence is round the corner, to keep hold of power and also not have to actually do things in government to change people's lives. You can see that in the cost of living crisis. Drew wants to criticise Boris Johnson, which he's right to do, because Boris and Rishi Sunak have simply not done enough to address the cost of living crisis. All the powers, you had powers to support people, but you chose to do the Rishi Sunak model of less than £4 a week. You've got the powers over railways, you chose to put up rail fares. You've got the powers over water charges, you put water charges up. So it's really easy, Drew, to pretend you're in opposition when you've been in government for 15 years. But the other point I would make is Drew wants to tell everybody that Brexit was really, really hard, which it was. Brexit was really, really tough, which it was. But somehow independence is going to be. Drew, we're not in some kind of childhood debating chamber now. So if you can let me finish the point, that would be good. Is this idea that somehow independence is really, really easy? It's a light switch moment, and there's no consequences, no dangers. Brexit was a mess. It's caused years of chaos. Why do we want that chaos right now in Scotland when we're in the midst of a cost of living crisis that Boris Johnson is failing on, but Nicola Sturgeon is failing on too, and the majority of Scots believe that Nicola Sturgeon, like Boris Johnson, is failing on the cost of living crisis? Let's focus on what matters to people right now, rather than Drew's obsession with constitutional politics.
Drew?
Well, you've heard it there from Annis. He's trying to ignore Brexit and the devastation it's...
I referenced Brexit.
Labour, now you're interrupting me after telling me off. Labour went hand in hand into this situation with the Tories in terms of allowing Brexit to happen. And now we're suffering the consequences. We're seeing rising prices because of increased costs due to trade imports. All these things have been imposed on Scotland. There's a majority of MSPs in the Scottish Parliament being elected on a prospectus of bringing forward a referendum to allow people in Scotland to have the choice. This is about the people of Scotland making their choice. And if Annis wants to take the arguments out to the people, as he's perfectly entitled to do, he's perfectly entitled to argue against independence, but let's do that in front of the people so that they can make the decision themselves. This should be a democratic choice for people in Scotland. It's their right to make decisions over their sovereignty, and when all the issues are laid before them, they can make the choices based on what they hear then and there.
I mean, Tobias, Drew Hendry is right. The SNP already have a mandate. They've been the dominant force in Scottish politics and in government over the past 15 years or so. They've made it very clear at every single election that they want independence. That is what they are about, and they want that second referendum. It's not sustainable for Boris Johnson and a Conservative government to keep saying no.
Well, this is the big question as to whether people support and vote for the SNP because they like the idea of the SNP running Scottish Parliament, running councils and so forth, versus actually tearing itself away from the union itself. And as we saw in the last referendum, actually, that's a bigger question. And I think if another referendum was held, you'd actually see more people saying, fine, I like what the SNP might be doing in Scotland, but I don't want to actually lose being part of the United Kingdom. And there's a question on your list that you read out that they would have to actually come to terms with. What about NATO? There's a huge military footprint up in Scotland, including our nuclear deterrent. And they, at the moment, are claiming that they want to be part of NATO, but they're going to kick out a critical part of the European nuclear deterrent. And that, I don't think is sustainable.
Can I come in on that, Joe?
Yes, Drew.
Yeah. I mean, we are committed to both being in NATO and in the EU, which is the most effective defence collaboration we could have. Well, the majority...
But you want the nuclear umbrella.
What Tobias would like you to not know is that the majority of NATO members don't have nuclear weapons. And it's not the norm for NATO members to have nuclear weapons. It's perfectly possible, probable for Scotland to be a NATO member without nuclear weapons on its soil.
Of course it is, but those countries that don't have nuclear weapons lean on the fact that we do. And what you're doing is shunting out a huge capability, which also, can I say, is critical to that part of the economy as well. That's going to cause huge upset in that part of Scotland, not least, expenses for our military. The bigger question is, how are you going to defend yourself? How are you going to create your own armed forces and then be part of NATO as well?
All right, very briefly, though.
I was just going to say, we're very happy to put that argument to the people of Scotland, for the people of Scotland to make their democratic choice, which they're entitled to do, having elected a parliament with a majority of MSPs with a mandate for an independence referendum.
Let's talk about the Labour Party. Show you this headline in the Daily Telegraph. Tony Blair endorses Keir Starmer in campaign advert ahead of the local elections. You saw a little bit of that in the headlines of Tony Blair endorsing his leadership. It's been 15 years since Tony Blair left Downing Street and 25 years since his landslide victory in 1997, but he still seems to be very present in British politics today. We're joined by Jess Barnard, Chair of Young Labour, to discuss how relevant he is. Hello to you, Jess. What was your reaction when you saw the video of Tony Blair endorsing Keir Starmer?
Well, thanks for having me. And, it's great to see the amount of support that Labour are getting, broad support that Labour are getting. And I think we're looking to do really well tomorrow in the local elections. But I think it's important to remember that in the current climate where we have a lying Prime Minister who's been fined for multiple breaches of laws that he himself introduced. We have a Chancellor that's been running away from paying taxes.
All right, but I want to concentrate on
Tory MPs
Tony
watching
Blair.
porn in Parliament. But the Tory party's full to the brim of dishonest jokers who've gotten far too comfy in their positions. But I think, I'll come to the point, but I think, what we saw yesterday doing the rounds was the story of people like Elsie, people affected by the decisions of this government. What we're hearing more and more is that these are affecting real people. And I'm sure MPs on the show will have stories about their own constituents who can't afford their heating or food or travel.
And Tony Blair?
And on that, so Labour's leadership, I think, need to step up and focus on that and demonstrate that actually we are very different from politicians of the past. We are very different from the current Tory government that is taking people for granted and acting like jokers
Tony Blair,
in our government.
So are you saying he's not relevant at all to the political environment?
I would say that Tony Blair, left government a very long time ago and doesn't have the answers to the current situations facing people. And they're the people that we need to be communicating to.
Right. I mean, Anna Sarwar, does Tony Blair come up on the doorstep? Do you ever talk about him with constituents or with people, voters generally? Is he still popular?
Well, look, I was 14 when we elected a Labour government back in 1997.
You're so young,
and I think people want to focus on the future. I think the important point to make about Tony Blair is, look, one of the things is, I'm not pretending that he didn't make mistakes. Every human being makes mistakes. Every government makes mistakes of every political colour. But what we can't deny is we have spent so much time since we won those elections shouting about all the things we thought Labour got wrong without championing the things that Labour got right. Labour changed this country for the better when it was in government, and we've got to demonstrate to people that we can change the country again. But if there's one lesson to be learned from Tony Blair's time and from those years was they were desperate every single day for Labour to win. And we've got to have that same desperation, that same hunger to win, that same desire to win, so we can change people's lives across the country, because the Labour Party is not a protest movement, it has to be a party of government.
Right, Jess, do you accept that?
I completely accept that. Obviously Blair won 3 elections. A large part of his success was his ability to create an electoral alliance across a wide voter base, right, under completely, very different circumstances, and namely that's.
And does the Labour Party need to do that again?
And the Labour Party does need to do that again. I think a lot of us are quite tired about being told to feel nostalgic about, who is, honestly, a deeply unpopular politician now, who did make some inexcusable decisions in his time in office. But we need to prove that Labour Party is the party to govern. And so the people who are deciding, that we need to be putting Blair front and centre of our kind of this factional battleground in the Labour Party, they need to move on. Like, we are here ready to come into government. You have hundreds of councillors and Labour councils across the country who are desperately doing their best for the local people. Why are we not putting them front and centre of our Labour Party? Why are we not championing the issues that people really care about? As we've heard, the cost of living crisis. Those are the issues people want to hear about.
Right. I mean, Anna Sarwar, do you think it is time for the Labour Party to move on? Is it strange, do you think, in some people's minds that the party's still very defined, either for or against, by Tony Blair?
Look, I think it's perfectly reasonable on the anniversary of the election in 1997, the 25-year anniversary, to have a video from the person that won that election campaign. But what we can't do is say that we are electing Blair 2.0. Keir knows that, Tony would know that we've got to elect Keir Starmer 1.0 in that election campaign, so we think about the future, not about the past. But I repeat again, the Labour Party loves talking about the things we got wrong. We got Iraq, for example, was a monumental error and mistake. Indeed. But we got so much right across our country, you know, having child poverty, lifting 1 million pensioners out of poverty, doubling our spending in the NHS, the creation of our Scottish Parliament. We need to champion the good things we did, but talk about what we're going to do next for people's lives.
Right. I mean, Jo, I don't know how old you were in 1997. It was your first
20 years old. It was my first vote, and I grew up in Ted Heath's constituency, and I voted Labour, and I was ecstatic when Tony Blair got in. I didn't sleep all night. I thought it was brilliant.
And now,
and then I was actually really let down.
And you were really let down?
I felt that it didn't achieve a lot of what it said it was going to achieve, and I actually felt the way that Tony Blair... I mean, no one leaves politics well, and I felt the way that Tony Blair left was pretty grim, and a reminder of how grim people can leave politics. I actually think it's a funny decision to use him, because he may well have turned some Tories. You know, there's a lot of people in the centre ground that would go, oh, actually, I remember voting back then because he appealed to me in that centre ground, which actually the parties haven't done for a long time. Both parties have gone completely in opposite directions. They've pulled against each other, and actually the next election is probably likely to be won by the ones that remember the centre ground voters. They're the ones that need to be concentrated.
You're nodding away there, Tobias?
Well, I just think we've been now in office for 12 years, and you do need to refresh, you need to morph, you need to advance forward, but also keep that broad church. And there is a worry, a danger that you end up moving to your base, to your right, providing policies that shore that up, but forgetting actually that what wins elections is those big grand policies with a vision that will take the country forward. That's what's going to excite the electorate. That's what's going to get more people voting for the Conservatives. That's what we now need to do.
Let me just show you this headline in the Times, Jess, and I'll get you to comment on it. It says Keir Starmer hints at expulsion for Labour's NATO-sceptic MPs. A group of about 10 or 11 Labour MPs, seen broadly as being to the left of the party. What did you make of that story?
Again, you know, move on. I think what people want to know about right now, you know, when I speak to people, my colleagues, or just people that I meet in daily life, people are asking what are they meant to do about how they pay for their energy bills, right? How do they afford food? We meet people that are using food banks more and more and more. The fact that you have people in Southside, in Labour Party HQ, briefing the press about this factional nonsense is really, really disappointing. We need to crack on and focus on the issues that people care about. And obviously, we have a duty to do that because, you know, during a recession, there is an unmanageable situation for people in this country with unregulated energy companies. We need to be saying what we're going to do about that.
All right.
Focusing on factional battles is not the issue. And I think, you know, obviously Blair is a multi-millionaire. He's deeply out of touch with people in this country and the struggles they're experiencing.
All right. Well,
what are we offering to them? Let's focus on that.
Well, let me get Anis's response to that story. Is it something you think that Keir Starmer needs to do for the Labour Party, expelling Labour's NATO-sceptic MPs?
Look, I think we need to have a firm position on NATO, but what the Labour Party needs to stop doing is talking to itself about itself and start talking to the people about the country. And that's the way you win elections. And I think that outward future focus is the way we get back to Labour winning again. Right,
but you heard Jo and Tobias both say, actually, it is about trying to persuade people to come back to the Labour Party, the broad church appealing to all wings. Isn't that what Labour needs to focus on?
No, I absolutely agree with both of those comments. The idea that you can only appeal to people that already vote for you and you win elections when you've been losing elections doesn't work unless we persuade people that didn't vote for us last time to vote for us next time. We can't win the election.
Right.
So, yes, we've got to keep a hold of our base, but we've got to build on that.
Right. I mean, in terms of this idea of perhaps Labour travelling to the right, Keir Starmer, can you understand the disappointment from some on the left that he does seem to have dropped the commitments he made during his leadership contest in terms of Jeremy Corbyn's economic prospectus?
Look, there's no journey to the right and left. I mean, I just don't believe that to be true. It's nonsense. We are real Labour, authentic Labour, and we've got to win on a Labour platform. But we've got to do it by persuading people that we can positively change the country rather than creating our own version of an us versus them in the face of a Tory us versus them, or in the case in Scotland of an SNP us versus them.
That's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. Thank you to all of my guests, to Drew Hendry and Anna Sarwar there, Jo Tanner and Tobias Elwood here in the studio. As we said, it is local elections day tomorrow, elections across the UK, and I will be presenting on Friday from 9 until 1. From all of us here, bye-bye.